Under a moonless night, the headlights of a car rounded a bend in the distance, its tires screeching loudly in the turn as the driver weaved from side to side down a dark country road. Inside, two women, having just left a nightclub, were laughing it up while sharing a joint on their way home. Behind the wheel, bobbing her head to the music, Nancy Thurston was rocking to Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf as she blasted the song over the speakers. Beside her was her longtime best friend Diane Savage, who was sitting back enjoying a couple of long tokes on a fat doobie while blowing O's against the windshield just to watch them explode into nothing. Laughing hysterically, Nancy continued telling Diane about something that happened half an hour earlier at the bar. So after you got up to go to the bathroom, he turned around and asked me if I'd like to make it a threesome. What a pig, Diane laughed. Then what did you do? Well, I let him buy me that expensive drink first, Nancy gloated. Then I threw it in his face. Diane nearly lost it. Told him that was the only way he was ever going to get his head wet by this girl. You know I don't play that shit. Choking on the smoke she had just inhaled from the doobie, Diane quickly handed it off to Nancy, who happily took a long drag on it. Oh, God, she squeaked, trying to hold her breath for a couple of seconds. This is some good shit. After a long exhale, she declared, I gotta start buying from your guy from now on. I told you he's got the best, Diane bragged. I'll say, agreed Nancy. From her position in the driver's seat, Nancy tried staying on the road and in her own lane, but no matter how hard she tried, she just kept weaving ever so slightly from side to side. While the headlights of her car barely lit the way in front of her, up ahead, the bright headlights of an oncoming car topped a hill about a quarter-mile away. Lowering the sun visor to shield her eyes from the halogen lamps of the approaching vehicle, Nancy cursed under her breath. Doesn't this asshole know he's got his high beams on? Diane shielded her eyes too. What a prick! As the two cars neared, Nancy angrily switched on her high beams to teach the other driver a lesson. But as they passed, the headlights overwhelmed her field of vision and Nancy closed her eyes. A loud bang exploded between both driver doors as the cars passed by, violently shaking the car the women were riding in. The loud noise caused Nancy to holler out with fright, and for a moment, her car rocked from side to side across the road as she fought to bring it back under control. Holy shit! Diane shouted as she twisted all the way around to take a look back at the other vehicle through the rear window of their car. That was a cop we hit! Nancy glanced over at her friend. What? Are you sure? Taking a peek out of her driver's side window, she immediately realized that her mirror was gone. Realizing that's how her and the other driver must have clipped each other, she began to panic. Glancing into her rear view mirror, she saw the other car in the middle of making a U-turn. Oh my God, her voice cracked. He's turning around. What are we gonna do? Diane cried out. We just struck a police car. We're both drunk and we're smoking weed. She paused a moment to think of the consequences. We're going to jail. Upon hearing that, Nancy shook her head in defiance and instantly decided to take control of the situation. No, we're not, she vowed. With that, she stepped on the gas and hightailed it out of there. Racing down a dark country road, riding the double yellow line at high rate of speed, Nancy was just too drunk, too high, and too scared to reconsider her actions. Careful, Nancy, Diane shouted to her friend, but it was too late. Traveling at nearly 70 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour zone, Nancy had forgotten about the hill that she saw the cop car come over. Bottoming out as hard as they hit the incline, the car went flying through the air several yards after clearing the top. In those few brief seconds, time slowed down for both women. Numbed to the moment from a concoction of alcohol, THC, and fear, the sense of weightlessness and flying lasted an eternity as their lives flashed before their eyes. When the car finally touched down again, everything jumped back into real time, and the violence of the impact caused Nancy to lose control. Bouncing hard to the right, the car swerved off the road and went airborne for a second time. Blasting over the tops of some fledgling trees, the car nose dived into a pond just 10 feet off the road before coming to a sudden stop. Dead in the water. Nancy awoke in total darkness, cold and wet, and unable to see anything around her. Sporting a splitting headache and the taste of blood, she tried to remember where she was and what had happened, but the veins throbbing in her head kept her from thinking straight. Holding her head back, she remained still to try to get her bearings. Feeling around with her hands, the first thing she was able to deduce was that she was behind the wheel of a car, which was sloping forward on a steep incline that prevented her from sitting comfortably in her seat. using her ears to further figure out her predicament. She could hear trickling water, the churning of bubbles, and lots of creaking. The more she began to figure out the seriousness of her situation, the more her fear began to rise. It was obvious that the car she was in was submerged underwater, and she could feel it rising quickly above her knees. After fumbling to unhook her seatbelt, she searched for the door handle. Upon finding it, she pulled up on it multiple times, but no matter how hard she tried to open the door, it just would not budge. Giving up on the door, she tried lowering the window, but the power button was dead. That's when the panic set in. Feeling around in the dark, she found her friend Diane still buckled in the passenger seat, but she was motionless. "Oh my God, Diane!" Nancy shouted. "Wake up, Diane, wake up!" When her friend didn't respond, Nancy placed her hands on her face. She could tell that her head was slumped forward, but at least she was still breathing. By now, the water had risen up to her waist and it was growing higher by the minute. Hyperventilating from the cold and fear, she started wondering how she was going to get her and her friend out of this mess she created. Remembering the officer she tried running from, Nancy started pounding on the roof as hard as she could, screaming for help at the top of her lungs, hoping against hope that maybe someone might be outside looking for them. Just a few seconds into it, however, she started crying, but she kept punching. Unexpectedly, Diane hollered out, "Would you please stop making all that racket?" Nancy suddenly cried out with jubilee, "Oh my God, you're alive! You're alive!" In the dark, she tried hugging her friend. "Of course I'm alive," Diane answered with an attitude. "Why are we in the dark? And why am I sitting in water?" Nancy backed off, ashamed to tell her the truth. "We crashed." "We crashed? And we're underwater." "What?" Diane asked angrily. "Are you shitting me?" Feeling the water now up to her belly button, she had no reason to doubt her friend. "Well, then we're going to have to get out of here," she told Nancy as she searched for the latch to release her seatbelt. "I'm so sorry," Nancy apologized with a crackling voice. "It was stupid of me to run from the police." Unhooking her seatbelt, Diane quickly searched for the handle. Finding it underwater, she quickly grabbed hold of it and pulled up again and again, repeatedly banging her body against the door. But it was no use. No matter what she did, the door refused to open. "We're going to die," Nancy nervously cried out. "Hold it together," Diane fired back. Reaching into her bra, she pulled out a Ziploc baggie with a lighter and her stash of weed. Removing the lighter, she tossed the baggie aside and ignited it. The flame from it cast a dim, shimmering glow of precious light throughout the inside of their flooding car, allowing each to see each other's face since the accident. While Diane looked okay, Nancy was sporting a serious abrasion across her forehead, possibly from hitting the steering wheel on impact. Taking into consideration the seriousness of their situation and how nervous her friend was, Diane poker-faced her friend's injury and acted as though there was nothing to be concerned about. They had to find a way out. With the water now up to their chest, the next thing to do was climb up into the back seat. Looking at her friend, she nodded her head towards the back of the car. "Come on, sis," she said to Nancy in a soothing voice. "We gotta get in the back." Nancy hesitated for a moment, but then with her friend's assistance, she climbed backwards into the back seat and scooted over to the driver's side. After her friend had moved out of the way, Diane canceled the flame. Clenching the bottom of the lighter between her teeth to keep it dry, she struggled to get into the back in the dark. As soon as she got situated, she ignited the flame once again. Immediately, both women looked to see where the water was. Still wet from the chest down, neither could feel it in their wet clothes. To their dismay, they found it up around their knees and getting noticeably higher. "Oh my God," Nancy stuttered with fear. Hiding her emotions, Diane glanced over at her friend. "Try opening your door." Placing the lighter back in her mouth, the two found themselves back in the dark, trying their hardest to open either door, but after about 30 seconds, they realized it was hopeless. By now, they didn't need to see that the water was back up to their chest and still rising, and it was at this point Diane finally started getting scared. "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" Nancy asked her friend in complete panic. Igniting the lighter once more, Diane found both her and Nancy up to their necks in the freezing cold water. It was obvious to her this was the end, as they each placed their faces against the roof of the car to capture their last few breaths. "I never got to tell Jacob I loved him before I left the house tonight," Nancy told her friend, crying hysterically. "He fell asleep on the couch before the babysitter came over." Diane started sobbing too. "I got into an argument with David before you picked me up, all because he asked me to stay home for date night." She paused while crying. "I should have stayed." At that moment, the car vibrated as it sank further down on a steeper incline, forcing the water to rise higher, even faster. In their final, terrifying seconds in the dark, they both shouted out their goodbyes to one another. Then, nothing but the sound of churning, bubbling water. It was about 9 a.m. when a teenage boy came walking along the banks of the river with his dog, Alex. Taking a different path than usual, Cal had decided to take this extra long way around because the temperature, humidity, and gentle breezes had combined to make for one beautiful morning. It was on these trips with his golden retriever that he would occasionally take pictures and video clips of themselves together with his cell phone and share them online. From time to time, however, he would get engrossed by something on the internet as his dog traveled ahead unleashed, and periodically, when he noticed his dog was getting too far, he would have to call out Alex's name to get him to slow down or stop until he caught up with him again. Texting his girlfriend on Messenger, he failed to notice Alex jumping up and down on his front paws, barking at something in the river. In fact, it wasn't his dog that got his attention at all, but the faint, irregular, muffled pounding and the barely audible screams for help coming from somewhere. Lifting his face from the phone, he looked around for the source of the shouting and thumping he was hearing, but it was only after several seconds had gone by that he finally realized his dog was trying to get his attention all along. Hurrying over to Alex, who was still jumping and barking at the water's edge, acting like he was going to jump in, Cal saw what it was his dog was reacting to. There in front of him, about 25 feet away, was the roof, rear window, and trunk of a submerged car jutting out of the water. To his shock and horror, he could see the shadows and hands slapping on the glass as those still inside called out to him for help, trying desperately to get his attention. Oh my God! Nearly 45 minutes after the call went out about a car in the river with survivors, police and rescue personnel were on the scene working hard to get the victims out of the vehicle. When an unexpected problem turned into a mystery, however, the officer in charge on the scene notified dispatch to get the sheriff to come out as soon as possible. Within minutes of the call, the sheriff rolled up in his SUV as a police officer walked towards him. As he exited the vehicle, the officer in charge at the crash scene greeted him. "Morning, Sheriff." "Bob." Closing the door to his cruiser, the sheriff glanced over the hood of his vehicle at the activity going on by the water's edge. Pulling up the waistband of his pants, he asked, "So what's going on? Dispatch told me that you found my mother's car?" Glancing down at the activity, too, Bob let out a big sigh. "Well, it's a little more complicated than that, sir." Raising an eyebrow, the sheriff faced Bob. "Complicated how?" "Well, we found the two women alive in the car," Bob told him. "What?" the sheriff snapped back. "Then you obviously got the information wrong." Bob shook his head. "I wish that were true, but it's not. I ran the plates 3 times myself." Looking the sheriff directly in the eye, he added, "It's your mother's car." Tilting his head to one side, the sheriff gave a look of disdain. "Explain to me how the hell that's possible. My mother disappeared 25 years ago." Bob stared at the ground for a moment, chewing on his bottom lip. "I don't know, but there's more." The sheriff stared at him. Looking back up, Bob hit him with the impossible. "The women in the car are identifying themselves as your mother and her friend who disappeared with her." The sheriff froze. "What?" He tried comprehending what the officer was telling him. "You're telling me that the 2 people in the car are saying they are Nancy Thurston and Diane Savage? The same 2 people who disappeared 25 years ago? And they're in my mother's car?" The officer nodded. "Yes." "So let me ask you this, Bob. If my mother's car has been in the river for 25 years, would it not stand to reason that her and Diane are dead?" "Yes." The sheriff was clearly becoming annoyed. "So if my mother's car has been at the bottom of the river for 25 years, how the hell did these people get in the car? Better question, who the hell are they?" Bob scratched his head. "Well, sir, that's why I had dispatch call you in. I felt you should be here to see this firsthand, yourself." Pointing towards the activity, the sheriff said, "Let's go." As the 2 men started walking towards the spot where the tow truck was attempting to pull the car out of the water, the sheriff asked, "So where are the women now?" "They're still in the car," Bob replied. The sheriff immediately stopped in his tracks. "Why's that?" Bob turned to face him. "Because no matter what they've attempted to do to extract the women from the vehicle, nothing has worked." With that, Bob continued walking, to which the sheriff promptly followed. "One more thing," Bob added. "Since the other woman is claiming to be Diane Savage, I called her ex-husband and told him what's going on. I figured he'd want to be here too. And he's on his way here." Walking down to the river's edge, the sheriff watched as the car came rolling out of the water backwards. Once it got about 10 feet onto dry land, the sheriff motioned to the tow truck driver to stop pulling it any further. Stepping up to the rusted, muddied car, the sheriff pulled on the driver door handle, then the back door, as the women inside called out to him. Gazing at the windows, he could see the shadows of their hands on the moldy, calcified glass. Hunching down a bit to try and peek inside, the sheriff assured them, "Okay, ladies, we're going to try to get you out as soon as possible. Just stay calm." Turning to the EMT squad leader, he said, "Get them out, please." As a half-dozen men got to work on freeing the women from the vehicle, the sheriff walked around to the back of the car and knelt down. Clearing away the remaining mud from the license plate, he instantly recognized it as belonging to his mother's car. Tears welled up in his eyes. Decades of wondering what happened to his mom was finally answered, although this new mystery still had to get solved. After several minutes, the men working on the car began scratching their heads. Something wasn't right. Nothing they did was even putting a dent in the car, and the glass was unbreakable. Stumped, the squad leader walked over to the sheriff and told him as much. The sheriff stood up and squinted his eyes in disbelief. "Well, you're the expert here," he said. "Is that even possible?" "I've never experienced anything like this," the man retorted. "You can't even break the glass?" The man shook his head. "No." Removing his nightstick from his belt, the sheriff stepped over to the rear window from the driver's side of the car. "Okay, ladies," he hollered out to them. "Look away from the window." "Okay," they answered in unison. After giving them a few seconds to turn away, he started pounding on the window with all of his might, but no matter how hard he tried, the glass would not break. Too tired to try anymore, he stepped back from the car, breathless. Slipping his baton back onto his belt, he stepped back over to the driver's door and tried opening it again. But nothing. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" "Yes," Nancy replied. "We are having trouble getting you out of the vehicle. Are you and your friend okay?" Both women answered, "Yes. How long do you think it's going to take before you can get us out of here?" Nancy then said, "We're wet and cold." "My men are working on a plan now," he told them. "My name is Sheriff Jacob Thurston. Can you tell me your names?" "How ironic," Nancy answered. "My little boy's name is Jacob Thurston, too. He's 6 years old. My name is Nancy Thurston." "My name is Diane Savage," she piped up. "Excuse me, Sheriff," Nancy called out from the car. "Has anyone notified my husband? I know he and my son must be absolutely worried." Sheriff Thurston glanced over at Bob, shaking his head. "I haven't got any verification on that yet, Nancy," he lied. "When I find out, I'll let you know." At that moment, Sheriff Thurston noticed Diane's ex-husband David strolling up to the car with a police escort. As they approached the vehicle, he directed them with a hand gesture to go over to the passenger side. Looking at the shadows through the passenger side window, he hesitantly called out his ex-wife's name. "Diane?" "David!" she cried out with excitement and a lot of tears. Placing her hands on the window, she apologized to him. "I'm so sorry. I was being selfish last night. I should have stayed home with you for our date night." Recognizing her voice, David stared at the faint moving shadow behind the hands on the window's interior. He was dumbfounded. "Diane, where have you been all this time?" "Nancy and I have been stuck in the car all night, underwater." Stepping back, David gave the car a once-over. Something was amiss. The car looked like it had been rusting away for decades. "David!" Diane called out to him as she forced the fingertips of both of her hands between the rubber molding around the window and the top of the glass. David saw his ex-wife's fingertips poking out above the window. She called out even louder, "David! Can you ever forgive me?" He stepped up to the window and cautiously reached out to let his fingertips touch hers. Her nails were freshly painted, her skin pink and pruned and unexpectedly warm with life. "I forgive you, Diane," he told her as their fingertips caressed each other. On the other side of the car, the sheriff was still talking to Nancy as she too pushed her fingertips through the top edge of the driver window. "Sheriff?" "Yes, Nancy." "Can you tell my son that I love him? I never got the chance to tell him that I loved him with all my heart before I left last night." The sheriff leaned in close to the window. He could barely recognize the voice because it had been so long since he last heard it. He reached out to touch her fingertips with his. "Of course I will tell him," he assured her as silent tears ran down his face. "And I know he loves you too." "Mom?" Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from within the car as the front doors burst wide open with great force, knocking both the sheriff and David backwards on their asses as the fully flooded interior spilled out onto the ground. To everyone's horror, two skeletal remains collapsed onto the ground in a heap of rotted skin, clothing, ligaments, and hair. As Sheriff Thurston and David Savage watched in disbelief from opposite sides of the car, the two corpses raised their skulls, reached out with their bony right hands and grabbed the feet of both men, and whispered, "Thank you."